You know, I was thrust into retirement at 53. I'm currently 54. I've been retired now for about almost a year. And I've realized in this time frame I had to make a hard decision. The company accelerated me into retirement, but the decision to continue staying retired came to one key point. There's actually 8 things that you need to own and make sure that you have in place before you call it quits, before you permanently say you're retired. And you know, now that I've been at this for about a year, I've looked back and I've said, yes, I think I've checked all those boxes and I'm good. And realistically, until you've done that, until you've gotten to a place where you have all of those elements in place, is skipping any one of these components can lead to a lot of struggle and a lot of stress in retirement. Now, we talk about a lot of the things that we won't give up. You know what? I won't miss going to work every day. I don't miss the grind, the busy traffic, the boss that's bearing down on me. I don't miss the deadlines and the performance conversations. And those things are all amazing. But you have to think about some things that you now need to replace. So there's still some accountabilities to yourself, to your family. You know, we have to own this. So I want to talk about some of these 8 components that are so important you have to have in place before you even think about retiring, because if you're missing it, it's going to cause some stress and anguish. First thing, of course, we talk about cars. You know what? A lot of times we need something to get around. You know, when you're retired, you're probably going to be tired. You don't really want to wrench on your old jalopy too much anymore. You don't want to keep fixing what you have. Maybe it's an old clunker. Maybe it's not that reliable. It's fine when you're just living the dream and you're cruising through life and you're working. You could, if you had to replace that vehicle, you could probably do it. But the last thing you want to do is buy a new car while you're retired. So ultimately, what you want to do before you retire is have that car in place. Maybe just buy it a year or 2, maybe 3 years before. Ideally, you still have a little bit of warranty left by the time you're actually retired. So you want to try to time that properly so you have a vehicle that's durable, that's reliable, that you're not going to have to constantly be fixing in your retirement years. I mean, if you're 65, you're 68, think about that. You probably don't want to be spending time underneath a vehicle dripping oil on a cold concrete floor. It's not a lot of fun. I love working on my own vehicles, and I'm sure a lot of you do as well. And it's fun to actually have an older vehicle that's cheap and easy to run. But if you're going into retirement, you've got to think long and hard about how much driving you're going to be doing, where you're going, the uses, and ultimately, you don't want to have yourself fixing vehicles every second day. So ultimately, ideally, you have a vehicle that's paid off as you sail into retirement. Another thing I thought about for some time, and actually, fortunately, what my wife and I, we got ahead of this many years in advance. You know, having several kids, you know, we have a lot of things that we were building up. We were trying to build a little bit of a, I guess you could call it an estate once a person passes, because that's ultimately what it becomes. But you ultimately have to have some decisions, and you have to have somebody in place to manage your money, your account, your estates, the goods, the assets. Where does that go? Who looks after them? So ultimately, you need an estate plan. You need some means to communicate through the lawyers and ultimately have somebody to take care of that for you. Because if you're gone, you need somebody to be able to deal with that. Hand out that car. What if you have a house, 2 houses? Who gets that? How do we distribute that out? You know, obviously, do you have kids? Do you have relatives? Do you have other people in place? You have to think about who's the executor, who's looking after this, who's giving the marching orders, who's taking care of the debts, who's distributing the assets, who's dealing with all of that. And of course, you have to have this information in a couple of places. Your lawyer, obviously, you're generally going to acquire with a lawyer. And ultimately, you want to keep a couple copies for yourself. What I've actually found that helped a lot, you know, I dealt with this year as well, dealing with the estate of my parents. One thing that they did, they had a couple of copies, one that was somewhere else, but they had the key copy in the freezer of the refrigerator. Because if, God forbid, there was an actual fire in the house, the fridge would likely save the will. That was the reasoning behind it. It's a steel box that's ice cold, and if there's a fire, it might actually have a chance on saving it during the fire. So ideally, you want to have a will that's available and it's well communicated in advance. Who are these recipients? Who's getting the goods? Who's the executor of the estate? You want to have these conversations beforehand, before you're unfortunately gone, so that everybody knows where they stand. The other thing is, too, you have to start thinking about if things change. It's not once and done. What we had to think about was a couple of major life-changing events. If, you know, again, God forbid, somebody goes through a divorce or something changes, maybe there's another major life event, or possibly even say one of the spouses passes away. Say the husband passes away. Well, as soon as that happens, now of course that does change the dynamic, and then the female spouse then has to go forward and look at rechanging that will again. It has to make sure that all the details are up to snuff and that everything is accurate, because that's something that I've been realizing in the last, I don't know, again, X amount of years. We've had our will in place for quite some time, but it's something you definitely want to have an estate plan, who's dealing with it, who's getting the beneficiaries, and who's managing your affairs. So ultimately, super important. Another thing that I have been thinking about, and I've obviously talked with all of you about this, is health. You've got to be taking care of your health. It doesn't matter in your 60s if you start, never, better late than never, but ultimately, health is something you've got to be looking at in your 30s and 40s and 50s, because then that lag effect catches up. If you've been smoking and drinking all your life and eating Kentucky Fried Chicken all through your 20s, 30s, and 40s, it's going to catch up. High blood pressure, high cholesterol, you're going to have problems with your blood, you might have plugged off arteries, heart conditions. I mean, the list goes on and on where you talk about the things and the impacts to your health. So ultimately, keeping in good shape, eating the right foods in your early years can yield dividends in your later years. That doesn't mean you end. All of a sudden you retire and you're like, well, I took care of myself for the last 20 or 30 years. That doesn't matter. This continues on. They say as you lose muscle mass, that has a bigger impact on the strength and the density of your bones and your muscles. So you have to take care of yourself, do physical activity, get out for those daily walks, do a little weightlifting, get out there, get active, and stay that way. Sure, you don't have to be Lou Ferrigno and benching, 450 and doing reps of 8. You just need to do a little bit of easier exercise, little activity. It's got to be regular. It's got to be consistent. Take care of your health. Stay active. Stay busy. And ultimately, that's one of the key elements. As well, continue eating proper food, a little more veggies, a lot of fruits. I'm doing a little bit more of a carnivore diet and skipping out on a lot of my carbohydrates. That's just something that I felt that I didn't want a whole lot of bread and carbohydrates in my diet anymore. There's lots of studies to show that it's not doing yourself the best, but I'm not here to debate that. I'm not the health nut here. I'm just saying, look after your health, eat the right foods, get some exercise, and continue on into your retirement. That's going to give you a longer lifespan and ultimately a better, more enjoyable life in your post years, in your retirement years. Another thing you have to think about is your retirement plan. Finances. Everybody needs finances in some way, and I talk about this in a little bit. I'm not the financial advisor. I don't want to talk about that in too much depth. Everybody has their own professionals at their beck and call. You have bankers, accountants, you have investment people. Engage these folks. That's what they do, and that's what they do best. Now, with that said, things like 401ks, Roth IRAs, as well, TFSAs in Canada. That's something where you can take an allotted amount for as well of post-income or essentially post-tax income, and you're living, you basically have a ceiling, but you can reinvest that, put this in this TFSA, and then when you retire, it's non-taxable. You can also enjoy some of the benefits of the growth of that account, and you don't have to pay taxes. As well, RRSPs, Registered Retirement Savings Plans, they're all very, very applicable. You also have to think about your overall portfolio, a good balance, and that's where dealing with your bankers are great. Have those conversations of a blend of more aggressive and more conservative stocks, bonds, things that maybe you're going to have to reap some benefit, things that might continue stronger growth, and other things, people talk about the S&P 500, you name it. I'm not here to throw those benefits around. Everybody has their own retirement plan, but have the plan. You need to have a plan where you're sustaining a little bit of your income, you're finding some growth, some savings. Not everybody has a defined benefit pension. If you have a defined benefit pension, that's gold. That's the golden handshake. Now, that's something that a lot of people don't have today. There was a time when you could do that. You work the corporate game, and a lot of people would get that, that pension at the end of the day. Now you can take an early version of that, and it's heavily trimmed down. But you can wait, every 5 years, it seems to give you another couple grand a month. So, to have your pension in place is a huge win. And it's something that you've got to incorporate into your overall portfolio and your savings plan, retirement plan. But 401ks, Roth IRAs, there's all these different plans. Whether you're dealing with your old age security, you can gain that later in your 60s, 65, Social Security. Of course, in the US, you can gain some of those benefits. There are a small amount of benefits, or I guess if you could say public pensions that you can get. Canada, CPP, Canadian Pension Plan. There's all of these little things, but old age security, CPP, as well as Social Security in the US, they're not your only solo go-to. If you're relying exclusively on those items, you're probably going to be living a hard life. So ultimately, leading up to this, if you're 67 and you have none of that in place, it's going to be a tough go. All I can say at that point is definitely focus a little bit more on the balance, spend a little more time at home, a little less time at the office, and switch your balance over. It's not going to work for everybody, but ultimately, if you want to focus on getting retired and do it safely, do it reliably, and do it predictably with less stress, you've got to have a retirement plan in place. You've got to have some investments in place. You've got to have some of that plan, and naturally can't rely solely on these public options, these public pension plans. They'll help you a little bit. They're a nice little top up, but they're certainly not going to pay the bills in its entirety. So you've got to have that in place, and you've got to be thinking about how you're going to sustain your lifestyle. Maybe you don't need $120,000 a year. Maybe all you need is $30,000 or $40,000 a year to survive. But whatever it is, you've got to run the numbers and remember COLA, right? The cost of living adjustments, that's real. So what you get in today, do your pensions do? Some of those allowables give you the adjustments for inflation. If they don't, you've got to be thinking ahead. You've got to extrapolate and start thinking about how much, in fact, you're going to need, not today, but based on average inflation rates, and that's where the bankers can help you, what you're going to need in 15, 20 years. If you make it that far, hopefully we all make it to 100, but you've got to be planning for that. And just in case that, you run out of money, that could be just a bad situation full of stress. So ultimately, have that retirement plan. Another thing that I always suggest, having a little bit around. Good old-fashioned moolah cash, right? You know what? It's always nice to have a little bit of that. Now, unfortunately, we know a lot of times somebody gets in a predicament with a healthcare issue or an incident. Next thing they know, they're in the hospital. Unfortunately, healthcare costs are extraordinarily high, and to have a little bit of money in the bank in cash is probably not going to necessarily take care of that. But what if something happens? What if you get sick? What if your job changes? What if you get laid off? You need some way to manage. And of course, if you're going to get laid off, if you're in retirement, that's likely the case. But ultimately, something happens. What if something, you need a new furnace, a roof falls apart on your house, or something changes and all of a sudden you need that extra $10,000, $20,000. What if you need that? If you don't have that and it wasn't part of the long-term retirement plan, you could find yourself snookered. So always have a little bit of cash on hand. Now, I don't suggest having $250,000 on hand for three reasons. Number one, main thing is the money's not working for you. Have your money in a place where it can work for you. It can start generating revenue. If you have $250,000 in cash, it's not doing anything. You're losing to the rate of inflation. The value of the money is going down year over year. So you need to have some cash, just not an extraordinarily large amount. Maybe have 6 to 8 months worth. That way you have some money, some fall back on. If something happens, you need some money to fix something in the house, fix your car, something goes off the rails, you need to have some extra spare money to cash money kicking around. Everybody needs cash. Cash is king. Now, again, not excessively. Think 6 to 8 months of cash of what you're currently generating or what you need for your budget to cover your bills, your taxes, property taxes, fuel costs, utilities. Think all those things. You need to have at least 6 months in place of cash sitting somewhere. Keep revisiting that. You might have to throw a few extra bucks in there once in a while just because the cost of living increases, but nonetheless, have a little bit of cash on hand. Another thing I also realized was, as I hit retirement, for me, it would sort of came on suddenly. A lot of people plan their retirement, they plan their exit, and they come off and they say, look, here's some things I need in place. I was sort of thrust into it, and we don't always have the options. Fortunately, from an investment perspective and my home and everything else, we had already been more or less there. Like, we're at that age in life where fortunately a lot of those things were in place, so I check a lot of the boxes, so it was less of an issue. However, you've got to think about some of the other factors, and that's how you going to manage your time. It's when you're in your career and you're hustling along and you're doing things, you're busy, then you're off work, then you make dinner, then you got to take your kid to soccer practice, then you're back, then you got to do a little reading, internet, browsing, whatever, and then it's time for bed. Get up in the morning, have your breakfast, head off to work, rinse, lather, repeat. You get the gist. You're busy, always. There's always something to do, always something going on, and always some kind of activity or accountability. But when you're retired, you don't have all of that. You don't have bosses screaming at you. You don't have a deliverable. You don't have the job to get to in the morning. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do? I've seen so many people that end up just sitting around watching TV for 6 to 8 hours a day, health deteriorating, eating munchies and Fritos, and not getting the exercise they need. They don't have a plan. You've got to have a plan. Own it to yourself. You yourself, this is an investment in your own time. Have that time plan strategy. Take on a side hustle. You know, for me, I've been side hustling. I've been doing the YouTube game, and I've been trying to build and manage some channels. That keeps me very busy and active. Well, yeah, it does provide some monetary benefit, 100%. It also gives me something very productive to do, and it gives me a reason to get up in the morning. It gives me a reason to keep pushing on. So ultimately, whether it's a hobby, whether it's joining maybe a swim club, maybe it's getting a new bike and exploring and doing this regularly. Maybe it's trying to track your health and you're doing this regularly and you're trying to create, maybe train for a triathlon. Whatever it is, train for that. Do it. Own it. But do it for yourself and do things that are going to help keep you active, keep you motivated and moving forward. Because ultimately, the worst thing you can do for yourself in retirement is have nothing to do, nowhere to go, and no one to talk to. It's going to be boring, and quite often, like I've shared the stories with my dad, for example. He retired. He went and golfed for, I think it was a year or so, then ended up back at work because he was driving, his wife crazy, and everybody was just sort of, what are we doing? What are we doing? And he just felt like he had to go back to work. His previous employer gave him an option to get back at it, back in the saddle. It was lucrative. They said, hey, get back at it. And he did. But unfortunately, it's a sad state when so many retirees have to go back to work, whether they have to or want to or need to, because they haven't taken care of that little detail called, a plan. And ultimately that plan is life and enjoyable and spending your time in a way that's fun and fruitful and somewhat productive. You don't have to be ultra productive. I mean, that's the point of your working career, but you want to get to a place where you actually have something to do, something to entertain yourself and spend your time doing. Another big thing that you have to think about and you have to have in place before you retire, or you have to be thinking transitioning into that. Because when you're working for your company, quite often the benefits are wonderful, especially if you're in corporate America or you're working some big company. I know I did. I had a lot of great benefits when I worked for the company. Travel benefits, healthcare, dental, eyewear. I mean, you name it, benefit. It was wonderful. It was great. I had all those things. You never think about it until it's gone. And so that's what it actually became. And fortunately for me, my wife's still working, so she's still drawing a lot of benefits for her employer. But the day will come when she no longer has those benefits. What was I going to do? Well, fortunate for me, the corporation I worked for, they ultimately have sort of a watered down version of a benefits plan. So it's not as wonderful as it was when I was working full time, but they do give me a retirement plan that's basically for life. So I was able to still, have a small amount of money that goes towards medication, small amount towards treatments. They've covered a lot of the bases. It's not perfect, but it's something. Not to mention, I know some places, you talk in Canada, for example, you have a lot of healthcare systems that are public. They're not amazing. Absolutely, by no means or no stretch of the imagination. You can wait 14 hours in a waiting room just to see a doctor, and then he tells you to go home. You're fine. It's just gas. At the end of the day, healthcare systems aren't great. I spent a number of years ago, we went down, did a trip down to Florida. So we had this extended travel healthcare and coverage that through the company that I was working for at the time. It wasn't the same one as recently, it was a company before. But we traveled down to Florida and 3 or 4 of us got really sick. Like I had a broken arm right there. I had a busted arm and I was traveling with a broken arm. We had a couple of young children and my wife, a couple of them got really, really sick. So we ended up having to check down into a local doctor. I don't know, it wasn't even a hospital. It was more of like an out clinic or something down in Florida. We were down in Kissimmee and Orlando area, and we stepped into this clinic, and it was amazing. There was nobody in the waiting room. We checked in. We were in the room within probably 5 minutes, and we all got checked over. We had our medications, subscriptions, or prescriptions, whatever, and we were off to the races. And the beauty is, well, they don't downside. We had to pay up front. The beauty is, though, our insurance company was able to pick up the costs after the fact. Our visit, the medication, everything was covered. And that's a beautiful thing. Not everybody has that. But you've got to be thinking that as you head into retirement, what does your healthcare look like? Because when you're working for some big company or you're working and you're moving along through life, you quite often have all of that and you take it for granted. But when you retire, that's gone. And when it's gone, it can be frightening. I mean, healthcare costs can be absolutely astronomical. And I've seen it where it can cost a huge amount of money. Imagine having a baby when you're in the States, overseas, maybe breaking an arm when you're down in the US and you don't have coverage. I mean, even little things like that, have a hernia, blow a gasket, right? And all of a sudden you find yourself having to go into the hospital to deal with something that can literally break the bank. And if you have some savings, that can eat it up very quickly. So you've got to be thinking about this before, and not just thinking about it, you've got to have something in place. And I know a lot of you have reached out and said, yeah, it's all well and good to retire at 53, but what about the healthcare? You know, Medicare and things like that, they're not great. I mean, you have some of these healthcare programs will kick in at say 65 or thereabouts. And, you know, even in Canada, you have some of that, but some of the extended healthcare programs aren't there for people that aren't part of these big corporations. And unfortunately, a lot of people end up out of pocket for a lot of things: medication, glasses, dental work. You know, you break a few teeth, maybe you go play some men's league hockey and you take a puck across the lips. Next thing you know, you got 5 teeth and you got to get root canals for all of that and some crowns. What is that going to cost you? That could literally break the bank. Well, same thing in the US. You've got to be thinking about that. Take care of your health as well, leading that up to that. And hopefully there's less of a draw on the medical system later on in life. Ultimately, that's going to save you money in the long run. But you've got to have that in place. You've got to have that insurance. And I understand a lot of you have spoken and said to me, you know, it cost me $800 or $1,100 or $1,200 a month just to pay for that insurance. And I know it's different in a lot of different countries, a lot of places. You have to pre-qualify, and then you can carry that throughout the years. If you try to pre-qualify later in life when you're a higher risk person, that's obviously going to cost you a lot more. If you can pre-qualify earlier on, sometimes they lock you in at a lower rate. Regardless, suffice it to say, you've got to put that in the budget. It's got to be part of what you manage going into that between when you retire. Say you want to retire at 55, which absolutely I advocate for 100%. 55 to 65, you've got 10 years of gap that you've got to fill before you get the public system. So you've got to be thinking about that and manage that accordingly. And maybe that's part of your plan, maybe that's part of your retirement plan, but you've got to have that budgeted in there so you can pay for those healthcare expenses, or so somebody else can pay for those healthcare expenses. We know it's a controversial topic. We know that it's not perfect, and there are times where people do get declined, but you need to have something in place to take care of your health. And definitely, again, as I said before, take care of your health with the right eating and exercise. Hopefully will reduce the amount of impact, because, you know, I get the sore shoulders. I get the aches and pains. We all have that as we age. You know, I'm almost 55 here myself, and I find myself very, very much often, you know, like thinking, oh boy, that's rough. You know, should I go see a doctor? But you know what? Be careful. I know in the US it's can be extremely expensive to go without coverage. So a lot of people unfortunately decline, or they don't even go, and they just suffer, and it's sad. So ultimately, thinking about that. Think about your health care, your health, and overall, and you've got to think about that as a priority. It has to be a priority. And instead of paying for a car payment, it's probably better to put it towards healthcare coverage. I mean, in most cases, that's ultimately going to save you in the long run and provide a much more stress-free retirement experience. Another one that's super critical is your home, rental, whether you've got a mortgage, what have you. I mean, ultimately, you can't have the big debts. And I've said this before, whether it's a car, which is your second biggest investment, and typically your primary investment, your house is the most expensive place you're going to spend in a given lifetime. In most cases, people spend more on their house than anything else. So ultimately, you have to make sure that you've budgeted accordingly. If you're renting, that you are making sure that you've got that covered, whether it's, you know, $1,500 a month, $2,000 a month, depends where you live. You may even have to think about renegotiating or relocating. You might have to think about moving out of that California place. You might have to go somewhere where lower cost of rent. But if you have a house, you've got to have it paid off. Ultimately, the mortgage, you have to be mortgage free. I mean, that's a major expense. And if you can shed that expense off your monthly budget, that's a huge, huge win. And ultimately, I've said this before too, that going into retirement, you cannot have big expenses like mortgage payments, car payments, big credit card debt that just constantly recycles. You have to have those things are all gone. Student loans, sometimes people go to school a little later in life. Maybe you want to become a doctor or a lawyer later in life, and you know you didn't get into it until your mid-40s, and now all of a sudden you find yourself still trying to recover from that big debt or from those student loans. Whatever it is, you have to be debt-free. But the house is the big one. You should realistically try to make sure that you're targeted, that your house is entirely paid off, and that if you are renting, that you're budgeting accordingly, because ultimately that is going to cause and be the source of many big days of struggle and stress and anguish. So ultimately, that's one thing I realized as a 54-year-old right now, and ultimately getting the boots at 53, and now I look down the barrel, I'm almost 55 here in June, and now I've realized after about a year in retirement those are the things that, fortunately, in most cases, I've checked the boxes, but you have to have those items looked after. You have to have them dealt with and manage those items effectively. Those 8 items are so important that once you've dealt with them, you can pretty much head off into retirement and be much less stressed out in those final days and that final third of your life. So anyway, with all of that said, everybody, you want to check out that video. Very popular. My dad's final words, as he was retiring. He just, it was so touching. I had to share that with you guys. And I know it was a very popular video, but you've definitely got to check it out if you haven't seen it already. Hope to see each and every one of you on the next one. See you real soon. Bye-bye.